Hello, everybody. Today we're jumping into Chapter 5, The Dementor. Tom woke Harry the next morning with his usual toothless grin and a cup of tea. Harry got dressed and was just persuading a disgruntled Hedwig back into her cage when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling a sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable. "The sooner we get on the train, the better," he said. "At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea on his photo of Penelope Clearwater. You know," Ron grimaced, "his girlfriend. She's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gone all blotchy." "I've got something to tell you," began Harry. But they were interrupted by Fred and George, who had looked in to congratulate Ron on infuriating Percy again. They headed down for breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly. "What were you saying?" Ron asked Harry as they sat down. "Later," Harry muttered as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all their trunks down the leaky cauldron's narrow staircase and piling them up near the door, with Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's screech owl, perched on top of their cages. A small wicker-work basket stood beside the heap of trunks, spitting loudly. "It's all right, Crookshanks," Hermione cooed through the wickerwork. "I'll let you out on the train." "No, you won't," snapped Ron. "What about poor Scabbers, eh?" He pointed at his chest, where a large lump indicated that Scabbers was curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, stuck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the short stretch of pavement towards the first of the two old-fashioned dark green cars, each which was driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. "In you go, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Harry got in the back of the car and was shortly joined by Hermione, Ron, and to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was very uneventful compared with Harry's trip on the night bus. The Ministry of Magic cars seemed almost ordinary, though Harry noticed that they could slide through gaps that Uncle Vernon's new company car certainly couldn't have managed. They reached King's Cross station with 20 minutes to spare. The ministry drivers found them trolleys, unloaded their trunks, touched their hats in a salute to Mr. Weasley, and drove away, somehow managing to jump to the head of an unmoving line at the traffic lights. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. "All right, then," he said, glancing around them. "Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry." Mr. Weasley strolled towards the barrier between 9 and 10. Mr. Weasley strolled towards the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, pushing Harry's trolley and apparently very interested in the Intercity 125 that had just arrived on platform 9. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leaned casually against the barrier. Harry imitated him. In a moment they had fallen sideways through the solid metal onto platform 9 3/4 and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine, puffing smoke over a platform packed with witches and wizards, seeing their children onto the train. Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting and had apparently taken the barrier at a run. "Ah, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to a girl with long curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so that she couldn't miss his shiny new badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Ron led the way to the end of the train, past packed compartments, to a carriage that looked quite empty. They loaded the trunks into it, stowed Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, and then went back outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all their children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave him an extra hug. "Do take care, won't you, Harry?" she said, as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here you are, Ron. No, they're not corned beef. Fred? Where's Fred? Here you are, dear." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley quietly. "Come over here a moment." He jerked his head towards a pillar. Harry followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave," said Mr. Weasley in a tense voice. "It's all right, Mr. Weasley," said Harry. "I already know." "You know? How could you know?" I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help hearing," Harry added quickly. "Sorry." "That's not the way I would have chosen for you to find out," said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. "No, honestly, it's okay. This way you haven't broken your word to Fudge, and I know what's going on." "Harry, you must be very scared." "I'm not," said Harry sincerely. "Really," he added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelieving. "I'm not going to be a hero, but seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he?" Mr. Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. "Harry, I knew you were, well, made of stronger stuff than Fudge seems to think, but I'm obviously pleased that you're not scared, but—" "Arthur!" called Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding the rest onto the train. "Arthur, what are you doing? It's about to go." "He's coming, Molly," said Mr. Weasley, but he turned back to Harry and kept talking in a lower voice and a more hurried voice. "Listen, I want you to give me your word." "That I'll be a good boy and stay in the castle," said Harry gloomily. "Not entirely," said Mr. Weasley, who looked more serious than Harry had ever seen him. "Harry, swear to me that you're not going to go looking for Black." Harry stared. "What?" There was a loud whistle. Guards were walking along the train, slamming all the doors shut. "Promise me, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, quickly, talking more quickly still. "Whatever happens." "Why would I go looking for someone who wants to kill me?" said Harry blankly. "Swear to me that whatever you might hear—" "Arthur, quickly!" cried Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing from the train. It had started to move. Harry ran to the compartment door, and Ron threw it open and stood back to let him in. They leaned out of the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley until the train turned the corner and blocked them from view. "I need to talk to you in private," Harry muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train picked up speed. "Go away, Ginny," said Ron. "Oh, that's nice," said Ginny huffily, and she stalked off. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off down the corridor looking for an empty compartment, but all were full except for the one at the very end of the train. This had only one occupant, a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry, Ron, and Hermione checked on the threshold. The Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and they had never seen an adult there before, except for the witch who pushed the food cart. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes that had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with gray. "Who do you reckon he is?" Ron hissed as they sat down and slid the door shut, taking the seats furthest away from the window. "Professor R.J. Lupin," whispered Hermione at once. "How'd you know that?" "It's on his case," she replied, pointing at the luggage rack over the man's head, where there was a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of neatly knotted strings. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across one corner in peeling letters. "Wonder what he teaches," said Ron, frowning at the Professor Lupin's pallid profile. "Well, that's obvious," whispered Hermione. "There's only one vacancy, isn't there? Defense against the dark arts." Harry, Ron, and Hermione had already had 2 Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers. Both of them had lasted only 1 year. There were rumors that the job was jinxed. "Well, I hope he's up to it," said Ron hopefully, or doubtfully. "Well, I hope he's up to it," said Ron doubtfully. "He looks like one good hex would finish him off, doesn't he? Anyway," he turned to Harry, "what were you going to tell us?" Harry explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument and the warning Mr. Weasley had just given him. When he'd finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, and Hermione had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them and said, "Sirius Black escaped to come after you? Oh, Harry, you'll have to be really, really careful. Don't go looking for trouble, Harry." "I don't go looking for trouble," Harry said, nettled. "Trouble always finds me." How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him?" said Ron shakily. They were taking the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much more frightened of Black than he was. "No one knows how he got out of Azkaban," said Ron, uncomfortably. "No one's ever done it before. And he was a top security prisoner, too." "But they'll catch him, won't they?" said Hermione earnestly. "I mean, they've got all the muggles looking out for him, too." "What's that noise?" said Ron suddenly. A faint, tiny sort of whistle was coming from somewhere. They looked all around the compartment. "It's coming from your trunk, Harry," said Ron, standing up and reaching into the luggage rack. A moment later, he had pulled the pocket sneakoscope out from between Harry's robes. It was spinning very fast in the palm of Ron's hand and glowing brilliantly. "Is that a sneakoscope?" said Hermione interestedly, standing up for a better look. "Yeah. Mind you, it's a very cheap one," said Ron. "It went haywire just as I was tying it to Errol's leg to send it to Harry." "Were you doing anything untrustworthy at the time?" said Hermione shrewdly. "No, well, I wasn't supposed to be using Errol. You know he's not really up to long journeys. But how else was I supposed to get Harry's present to him?" "Stick it back in the trunk," Harry advised as the sneakoscope whistled piercingly, "or it'll wake him up." He nodded towards Professor Lupin. Ron stuffed the sneakoscope into a particularly horrible pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, which deadened the sound, then closed the lid of the trunk. "We could get it checked in Hogsmeade," said Ron, sitting back down. "They sell all sorts of things, dervish and bags, magical instruments and stuff. Fred and George told me." "Do you know much about Hogsmeade?" asked Hermione keenly. "I've read it's the only entirely non-Muggle settlement in Britain." "Yeah, I think it is," said Ron, in an offhand sort of way. "But that's not why I want to go. I just want to get inside Honeydukes." "What's that?" said Hermione. "It's this sweet shop," said Ron, a dreamy look coming over his face, "where they've got everything. Pepper imps, they make you smoke at the mouth, and great fat chocolate balls full of strawberry mousse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills, which you can suck in class, and just look like you're thinking what to write next." "But Hogsmeade's a very interesting place, isn't it?" Hermione pressed on eagerly. "In Sites of Historical Sorcery, it says the inn was the headquarters for the 1612 Goblin Rebellion, and the Shrieking Shack's supposed to be the most severely haunted building in Britain." And that's where we're going to stop it for this round.